Good afternoon and welcome to bookmakers.com TV. As always, I'm Darren Hughes and I'm delighted to once again be joined by boxing expert David Payne, also known as the Boxing Writer on Twitter. David, I hope all is well with you after we were treated to a fairly stunning performance, I would say, from Liam Smith on Saturday evening, which you flagged up around this time last week. You must have been pretty pleased with that.
Oh well, yes. From a pundit's point of view, it's always nice to pick the winner. It was a fun fight. The event didn't quite catch fire until the main event, unfortunately, despite the undercard looking pretty solid in advance. So it was good to have such a spectacular finish, and fair play to Liam Smith, who we picked to win, but didn't expect him to be able to do it so violently, as it were, in the fourth round. So great for him, and obviously bad news for Eubank. And how he rebuilds from here is difficult to tell, but I think it won't be the end of either story. And who knows, we may be talking in preview about a rematch at some point in the future.
Absolutely, yeah. It seems to have set itself up for that, and as you kind of say there, it could lead to pretty decent payday for both fighters. So we'll wait with bated breath on that one and see where we get to. But this week we're here to discuss another top quality matchup, this time in the shape of Artur Beterbiev and Anthony Yarde. And as you allude to in your excellent column on bookmakers.com, which is linked in the description below, Beterbiev is maybe a name that's a little bit unfamiliar to most viewers, despite a career that has been lined with titles, belts, and various successes. So can you give us a quick intro on both the Russian Canadian fighter and then his relatively inexperienced opponent, Anthony Yarde, kind of a who's who of both fighters, please?
Of course, yes. Artur Beterbiev is well known, as I allude to in the article, among boxing circles. He's 38 years old now. He's been a pro for approaching 10 years. But he was known as a very destructive, very competent, very skilled amateur, having been the amateur world champion in 2007, I think it was, as well as a silver medalist the year before. He's gone quite a long way in Olympics as well before he ran into Alexander Usyk, who may be known to viewers, and was very competitive with him. So as an amateur, he was a standout star, as it was, as they're often emerging from Russia with that great style of theirs, or from the former Soviet bloc with that great style of theirs. And as a professional, he's continued in the same vein. He's not been as active as we would like. He's managed 18 fights in that 10 years. But most of them have been a pretty high grade. Obviously, like many champions, the pandemic interrupted slightly a little of the momentum. So we would like to have seen him more often, but when we have seen him, and for viewers who see him for the first time this weekend, they're in for a treat, because they're in for a stone-faced, methodical killer in the ring. So a guy who doesn't necessarily take you out with one shot, but puts you through the meat grinder. He will land shots on the inside, both hands, uppercuts. He will pummel you from the outside, however you would like it. You've got pain coming, and that's the prospect that faces Anthony Yarde this weekend, who's the polar opposite. This is a guy who, at 31 years of age, about 7 or 8 years ago, turned pro with just 12 amateur fights, whereas Beterbiev will have had many hundreds of amateur fights against the best in the world. And Yarde converted to the paid ranks without that background. So he's been learning on the job. But again, he's not been especially busy. I think he's managed 25, 26 fights in his 7 or 8 years. And he's done things unconventionally. So he's with an unconventional trainer who brings a very different perspective to things. And aside from a fight with another Russian killer 3-4 years ago, which he was patently not qualified to take, but did surprisingly well in at moments, and a win and loss at British title level, he again is jumping into the deep end here. So although 31, he's a novice in professional terms and amateur terms as a body of work compared to his opponent on Saturday. So there's a lot of intangibles, but there's a lot of tangibles that point to an entertaining, explosive fight for those who like a good tear up, as it were, and those who like to see heavy punches, because both can definitely punch.
We'll come to how the fight might actually look in a minute, but I want to just jump on something you did say there, because there are suggestions, not just from yourself, but in the boxing media at large, that Yarde's slim chances of victory aren't going to be helped by his backroom team and principally the main man in his corner, Tunde Ajayi. Can you tell us what his training camp might have looked like? Would you have any idea how Beterbiev is going to have the edge in this aspect of the fight, and just how different Yarde's sort of preparation might have been to what might be expected conventionally?
Okay, well, from the outside, I've not been inside the gym, but from the outside, Ajayi has built a reputation first for delivering cameo videos, if you like. And I don't wish to do him a disservice, but this is the reputation that is projected ahead of him of the kind of Floyd Mayweather pad sequences. So he's done an awful lot of those kind of things that caught the eye. And the fighters that he's worked with, Yarde being the most high profile, I guess, these days, have been loyal to him. And he's developed Yarde to some extent, but he very deliberately positions himself as a counterculture person within the boxing fraternity. So he presents himself as someone who knows things that other people don't know, who has insight that other people don't have. Um, so he's seen as a very kind of what's the word? Well, counterculture, peripheral, marginal, peculiar figure, and that was probably. I'll come on to the contrast with Beterbiev in a second, but it was probably best presented in Snapshot when Yarde fought Sergei Kovalev, who was the #1 guy in the light heavyweight division at the time, although like Beterbiev, coming towards the end of a career at 38, I think he was at the time. And Yarde fought him, was losing, but it got to the 8th round. And as the fresher, younger fighter, you might think maybe there's hope for him to come forward over rounds, coming towards the championship distance, a distance I don't think he'd ever travelled at the time. And Tunde gave him the corner advice to go all in, to empty the tank, as the phrase goes. So to give everything he had left to try to knock Kovalev out in the 8th round, which just seemed counterintuitive, seemed to go against, as Ajayi often does, against all conventional thinking. Remarkably, Yarde almost got Kovalev out of there in the 8th round. He knocked him around the ring, etc., but then didn't succeed in knocking him out and went back to his stool absolutely exhausted. And 2-3 rounds later was dropped by jab and couldn't get up. So it felt like an opportunity slipped through his fingers. And that's the kind of head-scratching moment that Ajayi can give you. And some of his quips at press conferences fully support that. And there was a lot of opinion that Yarde would be better served going to someone more conventional who could perhaps utilise his very obvious natural physical gifts to better effect. But he's been loyal to that trainer, and we will see what fruits of that labour we've had and that fruits of that loyalty this weekend to see whether he really has developed. Because in the win-loss with Lyndon Arthur at British title level, there was a lot to suggest he hadn't really progressed in the way that he would need to have a chance in this fight. And flip side, long answer, sorry. But the flip side to that is Beterbiev has obviously got that massive body of boxing acumen in his own head. So, yes, he's got good trainers around him, but he's coming at this as a very experienced fighter who's been fighting at world level for the best part of 20 years at amateur and professional level and has every tool in the book. He may not be the quickest, he may not be the youngest, but he's got every skill, every punch, will not be disorganized easily. But as we talked about last week with Liam Smith, he's the guy with all the grounding, all the experience, all the seasoning coming into this fight. So they are very contrasting stories about how they arrive at this fight on Saturday.
Interesting. Yeah, that seems to be the impression given, I think, as we said, from the general boxing media. Seems to be the consensus that there's perhaps a more professional aspect to Beterbiev's preparation and attitude towards the sport, whereas maybe this might be slightly unfair, but Yarde is maybe coming at this from more of a hit and hope perspective. What do you think the fight's going to look like? Look, you kind of alluded to Beterbiev being able to box any way you like. Can viewers expect a slugfest, or will the wily, experienced, crafty older fighter choose to box clever?
I think from Beterbiev's point of view, he has put fighters who have never been dropped before on the floor early in fights, and he's knocked people out who have not been knocked out before. He's that kind of puncher. So a little bit like Golovkin before him, for those who have not seen him, he kind of operated in this unspoken world where fighters didn't want to talk about him, didn't want to give him a profile because he's just such a dangerous fighter. So he breaks people down quickly, or he can do it over longer rounds. So take his time. He has been dropped twice, which is probably giving Yarde some hope that he can be dropped, including by English compatriot Callum Johnson about 4 years ago. Dropped Beterbiev quite hard in the second round of their fight, but went on to lose in 4 rounds, having been dropped in the first round himself. And I think he's been dropped once previously by Jeff Page Jr., who was a prospect at the time. So there are gaps, and he can be hurt, but he's never been disorientated to the point of being under real pressure subsequent. So I see a fight probably where Yarde has got 2 strategies. He can hope that his youth and his speed can perhaps keep Beterbiev off balance, not able to launch these combination attacks, perhaps take the fight later in the hope that Beterbiev is aging, that his engine is not what it was. He's not been a massively active fighter. He is now 38. Or Yarde can take the approach of, I'm going to use that speed and power and the element of surprise, and I'm just going to go for him. I'm just going to go all out from the first bell, try to surprise him, try to catch him cold, try and make a breakthrough. Those are the 2 conceivable strategies. Personally, I think the first one will be fun, so we could see that. It's conceivable they go for it, and I think he will be met by a lot of power coming back that he can't live with and has not had the experience to live with. And I think Beterbiev will probably win that firefight. If he goes for the second strategy of waiting until later, of trying to box off, he will sacrifice his own, Yarde will sacrifice his own style. He's not a box from the outside kind of guy himself. He's a stalker. He walks around, tries to close distance, tries to get those big, powerful hooks off himself. So I can't see him being able to pick and prod and just get to the second half of the fight and then try to bring the power shots. So with his inexperience, he could get caught between the 2 strategies and end up getting folded up pretty early. I don't think he brings anything that's going to surprise or shock Beterbiev, really. So I see a painful night for Yarde here. And for me, it's more of a case of when rather than if he runs into the kind of problems that every other of the 18 fighters Beterbiev has fallen for. You know, those kind of destructive punches that have taken care of bigger, more robust, more experienced people than Yarde. So he's relying a lot on youth here.
Okay, so from our discussion, I think it's fair to say it's quite clear you expect Beterbiev to dispatch Yarde with relative ease. Though, as you do say in your column, odds of 1-7 might be prohibitive to the working man about Beterbiev. So how do you see the fight finishing? I'm going to push you for a verdict here. You've given a couple of possibilities as we've spoken already, but what would be the one you'd nail your colours to the mast on?
Well, as you say, that from a betting perspective, the odds on just backing Beterbiev to win are very small at 1-7. I can't build a case for a Yarde upset in the way that I could last week. It was totally different horses for courses, but he's a big underdog here. I think 6-1, and deservedly so based on the tangible things that we have. If you're willing to indulge the idea that he can make a breakthrough against an older fighter, then there's some big odds available on rounds. But I think more sensibly is trying to be precise about when the end might come. Again, even the single round odds, I believe, are widely anywhere from as tight as 8-1 through to about 12-14-1 for Beterbiev on any single round, which regular bettors on boxing will recognise is pretty tight pricing. I'm inclined to think that Yarde's youth and courage and his own power and Beterbiev's kind of methodical style might take this into the middle rounds, that Yarde might, I'm willing to believe that he might get out of those early rounds and get through to a middle round sort of area, but I think he's probably accumulating damage by then. So I'm willing to believe that maybe a 6 or a 7 or an 8th round. If you look at Beterbiev's record, it tends to be early or 9-10. He tends to take people out. So I think those middle rounds are, and that's reflected in the odds. There seems to be some kind of, I think 17-2, 8-1, that kind of thing on a 5th or 6th round. So I think if you were to kind of pitch some modest investment in those middle rounds on the individual round betting, then there may be a return for you, in my opinion.
Okay, so we can dutch up a couple of the round bets there and see if we can come out with a decent price that that might give us an equal return, regardless when he actually manages to stop it. So, look, David, that's pretty much the end of our discussion there. As we've alluded to there, should be a fairly straightforward night for Beterbiev. In kind of stark contrast to perhaps the fight last week, which you correctly called as being a lot tighter than the odds suggested at the time. David's column is available as always on bookmakers.com for this fight for those of you that prefer the written word, and you can get David at the Boxing Writer on Twitter. David, thank you very, very much as always, and we'll see you again soon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.